This is The Other Future. Our guest this morning is calling from Sweden, and we had a little difficulty on the line, but he is now with us. The Other Future comes to you every other Thursday from 9 to 10 in the morning. The original intent of the show was to bring people on to talk about projects, essentially projects that are counter to the grim narrative we have in the media. Grim narrative, I originally did say that came from the election of Donald Trump, but now we have a selection of proto-fascists and actual fascists across the world to choose from. My guest is a world traveler. Like me, he's from the Central Appalachian area of the United States, Kentucky specifically. He's an artist, a musician, and an archaeologist. His name is Ephraim McDowell. And Ephraim, are you with us?
I am. If
excellent.
You can hear me, I am.
I can hear you.
All right.
We had a little moment getting you on, but it's funny because I try and bring guests on here globally, and every now and then you have problems with time and with connection and things like that. So I really appreciate you working with us on that.
Oh yeah, pleasure.
Can you say something about yourself just by way of introduction?
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you for your introduction that you just gave me. By the way, I'm in Stockholm, Sweden now. Sun is setting out on the Baltic, fiery red. And actually, it came up on the Baltic. It's setting in the Atlantic. Right. I'm a Kentuckian like yourself. Let's see. What should I say about myself here, man? That just a little side note. That little Skype thing just set me 5 feet.
It's all right. I'll tell you what. Let me throw some things out here because you've got such an interesting background, and I view you. I look because of all your travels, especially. I look at you as someone who can shed some insight on the world at this time and on our predicament, if you want to put it in those kind of existential terms. But right now you're in Sweden and you're working on a book on American history, correct?
Well, I'm not really working on a book on American history. Actually, my gig here right now is I'm a script writer. I'm writing American history for a educational platform, kind of an app that's a company out of Stockholm that works. It's presented in multiple languages. I'm the English language social science guy here, and that's a weird story and how I would ever get a gig like that. I would never get a gig like that in America, but when you're an expat,
right.
when you're abroad, you can reinvent yourself, and people sometimes take it. And but I do have a background in archaeology and deep background in history, actually, of America, of the whole world. It's all tied together. So I'm script writing here. I'm writing all these little, they come out as animation, little curriculum sets. I mean, they're giving me things like, right now I'm working on the story of Native Americans, or actually indigenous peoples of the Americas.
Right.
That's how I framed it. And the insane thing is, because the way the digital medium, the platform is laid out, I only get 550 words, 600 at the max to tell big stories.
Wow.
In 5 minutes, working with animators. So it's really sharpening up my poetry. It's poetic. How to tell a story, the economy of words. And
what do you find in Sweden when you're trying to communicate with people in Stockholm or in Sweden in general? What do you find is the perception of what's going on in the United States? I have to always turn it back to us, not to be that narcissistic, but at the same time,
well, of course,
it's where we are.
Yeah, I always turn it back to America myself, no matter where I'm living in the world, because it's all tied together for one, and it's my frame of reference. Right. And I can't get past that. As much as I may try at times, I can't get past being a Kentuckian or being an American. And the weight, the real weight that goes with that of both real and imaginary crimes to the whole stew that we're all in this world. So you're asking about Sweden. Sweden's an interesting place.
Now you took your family there, right?
Yeah, or my family brought me here, however you want to look at it. My wife got the gig here, and that allowed for this to happen. For an American to work and live in Sweden or anywhere outside the United States is incredibly difficult, and I don't think we as Americans really realize how fenced in we are in the American. I mean, those walls and boundaries, the ones that Trump are trying to build, are to keep us in as much as others from getting in.
Right.
And to work in the EU is very difficult for an American. You have to either a pretty big company that can afford to do it needs to hire you, so it's usually tech sector. My wife, actually, going back a few years, George Bush won. She saw the writing on the wall, and my wife, should be here telling stories herself, because she's an amazing character, and she's the reason I've been able to leave the American reservation and go live and work in so many places. She's from Scranton. She's an Italian-Irish coal miner, truck driver's daughter from Scranton who got out in high school, moved to Sweden at the Rotary Club scholarship. They sent her to Lapland, to Samiland up north, where they don't speak much English, at least not in the mid '80s.
Right.
Where she learned Swedish, and she still has it. She was able to get a gig. Well, back to George Bush 1. She saw the writing on the wall. She lived and worked abroad a lot. She knew what was going on and knew that we needed options. And those options, actually, this was George Bush 2. One was other thing, but she got her Italian citizenship so that we would have options to leave the U.S., because you really need another passport if you want to go and stay for a while.
That's really smart. Yeah, I was working in France a couple of years ago and had an offer, but I looked into it, and you could get, as a creative person, there's a creative passport, basically, a creative leave from the U.S. prison, and you could go over there and work, but I think you had to return for a time every 6 months. I've forgotten the details. Yep. Okay.
Yeah, and it's changed a lot. The last 10 years have been very dynamic in working and living abroad and the rules thereof. And with the EU becoming closer and closer to evaporating.
Right.
I mean, the EU has been a great thing to allow freedom of movement over borders. And if you have an EU passport through an EU country, my wife got Italy because she was able to trace her family, her grandparents, who never denounced. They came over in 1920. They were peasants. Right. They never denounced their Italian citizenship. And there's ways that you could prove that, and you can get your Italian I mean, if it's a grandparent, you can get it.
Oh.
But there's a lot of hoops you have to go through, and the same for Ireland. There's a whole lot of hoops you have to go through, and it's expensive. But then you have that passport for Ireland or for Italy, and that opens the door to the whole EU as far as working and living freedom of movement.
Right.
And it's amazing here. Living and working in Sweden, I see a whole bunch of Brits, and they're all sweating right now because of Brexit. They're really, really worried. They're getting ready to lose. I mean, they're going to be kicked out.
Wow.
And people who've been here 30 years and have lives built here, houses, cars, the whole shebang.
That's similar to what's happening in the U.S.
Yeah.
Deportation.
So, and so what I see in Sweden is an interesting place because it's very Americanized in some ways.
Right.
As far as they grow up with the TV shows and all that, like the rest of the world. English is taught in the schools, Swedish schools, so everyone has from a super excellent. They basically grow up and they pick what accent they want. If they want a British English or American English, and they can switch back and forth, and it's really confusing. And all the time, I have these. I'm able to go about here as an English speaker, no problem. And a whole other side story I could tell is about SFE, which is the Swedish for Immigrants course that the state provides, because the immigration into Sweden, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, has been massive.
Right.
And it's part of the reason Sweden might be, it's refiguring itself out, and maybe not for the best ways.
Yeah, I know that two things that I can add to that from my perspective, in New York, is that, basically there's a rise of the right in Sweden in a big way that's coming.
There is.
And there's also
last week they were.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say last week they're the second most popular party now, second largest party in Sweden. They're growing exponentially.
I didn't know it was
the Swedish Democrats. That's the name of the party, Swedish Democrats. Yes, and they're going to take it, and they're going to probably pull Sweden out of the EU if that happens.
Wow!
And it's very very fluid, very alive, changing.
I know
fast.
Stockholm. Before that, at least, Stockholm is the fastest growing city in all of Europe. Correct? I don't know if that's still the case. It was 4 years ago.
It certainly could be. I don't know. It feels like it. The real estate market here makes you feel like it because it's insane.
Right.
There's this this old socialist times 20th century system with basically, if you want to rent an apartment like a normal person anywhere in the world, you can't unless you get in the queue, and there's about a 16, 18-year line.
Wow.
Once you're in that queue and you have your Swedish person number and you're a person in the Swedish system, there's a whole bunch of hoops you have to go through. But immigrants, Syrians, Afghanis, people who come here from all over the world and who do the system right, and they get their jobs and they work their ways up, the whole American dream.
Right.
There's an equivalent in Sweden of the American dream, the Swedish dream, I suppose. And so they wait their 16 years and they get an apartment, and they're good Swedes, and they do everything correct and by the book. But there's not enough apartments, and for one, who can wait 16 years before you can rent a place? Period.
Yeah.
So there's a whole second-hand, they call it second-hand rental market, where people will have somebody will own the apartment, and within the Swedish system will rent it out for the legal price, which say is $800 a month or something. Then somebody will lease it out, and somebody will lease it out, and they go down this chain, and everybody's getting a cut. Then it's right. New York prices for a little place. You're paying $2,200, $2,500 a month.
That happens in a lot of places. I heard that in Egypt.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because all these U.S. citizens, when George Bush II got elected in 2000, there was this threat by many people online and Hollywood celebrities talking about leaving the country if he wasn't removed from office, because we know he was appointed, well, not elected. And,
absolutely.
And so now, though, as the situation that people were perceiving has worsened exponentially, as you said in Sweden, has worsened exponentially here, you actually have a flow of Americans to Canada, to the EU, and I've kept track of that because at different times I've actually wanted to, and still I'm considering leaving the U.S., with how bad things have gotten here, the healthcare being one. But I want to return to something, because you talked about how Americans are not only kept out of the rest of the world, but they're basically like, they're kept, in this mental prison, much less a physical prison. Well, here's an experience I had. Let me give this to you and let you run with this.
Sure.
I met someone high up in a foreign intelligence, not through the U.S., but he was working for another country. And it sounds spooky, but I met him actually in the under the aegis of beer and beer making. So it's not as CIA type spy versus spy. But
I mean, I love spooks that way, actually.
Right. Well, I got talking with him, and I asked him his role and what he was doing, and I said, this is intelligence. And we didn't really pursue that, but we were talking into the night at one point, and I said, if you look at, he was talking about American media, and he doesn't allow his children to watch any American news. They get schooled at an international school in New York City. And I mentioned to him, I said, if you laid out, for instance, this is how bad American media is, as I was telling him. If you laid out a series of events that took place from 2010 to 2015 in Libya, and you looked at the coverage in American media, and I'm not talking about the ludicrous level of Fox News, but the MSNBC, the CNN, the ABC, and so forth, everything they said, you looked at that line, and he interrupted me, and he said, between those two, there is no point of contact. And that's what frustrated me, not that you're discussing particular internal politics of the United States with your fellow citizen, but the fact that if you're discussing anything with anyone in the U.S. and their knowledge comes from American high school textbooks, American college textbooks, American TV.
Absolutely.
Media,
yes.
They're purposely misled in such a grand way that it's almost impossible for them to perceive what's going on in the rest of the world.
Absolutely. Our education system as a whole, and then you can go to the media, to the news, to the pop consumed printed word, it's a mineral valueless. It's deprived of any. Well, we all know that anybody who thinks and goes beyond the 6 inches of depth or lack of depth in those sources starts to realize, wow, I've been consumed with nothingness.
Right.
So yeah, and you can't get history in the United States hardly. Going back to how we started talking about history, because that's what led me down all these roads, led me into trying to work in art and all the creative parts of my life. Being a musician, a banjo player,
right,
was a sense as a kid in Kentucky of history. I mean, history and science fiction are kind of like the same. They're both future facing. I mean, if the history tells you a lot about the future, and science fiction tells you a lot about the future, and they're both, this is on my mind a lot lately about how important a historic depth is, partly because I'm writing about it a lot right now, and I'm researching all these I wrote a couple, 2 or 3 little scripts here about the American Civil War, which made me realize the American Civil War all over again with fresh eyes, from being outside of the United States. I mean, I realized King Cotton and the just how slavery and settler colonialism. I'm going to go off in all kinds of tangents in different directions, so you're going to have to lasso me in certain ways, maybe. But that's what we're built upon. I'm more than anything, more than like facts and numbers. I've kind of seen myself, or I've become over time, like a resource of like who the good historians are, or what where the good materials can be. Because I've spent literally my whole life in Kentucky or abroad the last 25 years. I guess I count other parts of the United States. Once I left Kentucky, I was an expat. I mean, even living in New England, I was an expat.
Right.
But
now you can feel that. I mean, the different parts of the country have different mannerisms, different senses of humor, different ways of conducting
absolutely.
themselves. A fellow, and it's become less differentiated because of communications, TV, much less just the internet. But but it's become much less so. So you are, to that extent, an expat. Have you read the book Dixie Be Damned?
I've glanced at it. I haven't really read it yet.
It's an excellent book, and they actually point out how in the American Civil War, the Northern industrialists were already working with plantation owners and raw material suppliers from the South, so that as the war was resolved, you had the industrialists, so-called, that were working with those plantation owners to industrialize the South. Like, these were already business contacts and business partnerships
absolutely.
made, and they they were purposely funneling people into an extreme wage slavery situation. I don't want to equate chattel and wage slavery, but there is a continuum, and and it's very clear how they perceived the continuum and didn't want to lose their free labor, and even if they had to pay a penny every now and then, they wanted to make sure that the wage slavery was as close to the chattel slavery as possible. It was very, very explicit.
Yeah, and that's a delicate conversation to have in America now too, because basically the psych ops have made even like liberal or communities that like to engage in intellectual thought and discourse. It's there's a divide in those circles now. Talking about history, there's a whole history of slavery. Within the university, it's. Oh man, I'm getting.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how the universities, because I'm around American university students all the time, living abroad because my wife works in international education, study abroad, right. And I've watched over the last 25 years students change and how they've. Oh, this is going to go a whole different way about the coddling and how you can't really talk about sensitive things in America anymore, even in the university setting with undergraduates.
How so?
Or else they call offense. Like you can't be some version of an Anglo-American, a white guy, and talk about slavery because or Native American indigenous issues. It's delicate. Like there's a new book that came out that I reviewed and I shared, and I got a lot of pushback, and some colleagues did too. It's called "Masterless Men: Poor Whites and Slavery in the Antebellum South" by a historian named Carrie Lee Merritt.
I don't know.
And it's pretty new, and it's worth it. I mean, it's along the lines of what you're talking about, and about how poor whites in the South have been played, and part of this stratigraphy of keeping oppression, of keeping people down. There was a slave class, but they use the poor whites never had a hope either.
Really? Have you read?
Oligarchy.
Have you read Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, an Indigenous History of the United States?
It's written right in front of me right here, man.
Excellent.
She's the top of my list. I was going to talk about her.
She's interesting, and she's interesting.
She's sharp
because she participated as an activist in a lot of American Indian movement politics, and as a labor organizer or labor participant with, I believe, the IWW. She's been involved with a lot of things and has been around, and like you, has been to many places. So I was intrigued by, since you were acquainted with that book, you're talking about some of the I don't consider them delicate topics, but I consider them.
I don't either.
I think that the way that go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, but there's real ramifications of people shutting you down in the academic world, trying to get professors fired for talking about delicate things.
Yeah, I don't think. Go ahead.
The camps. We all have our camps, and people can't deviate from their camp, apparently.
The more I hear about that kind of stuff, I'm sorry, I just wanted to add, the more I hear about that and actually read those cases, the more I think those are very manufactured situations that people are using. That in talking with friends that are talking about some of the more almost neurotic attacks on history, they seem to be ways of shutting down inquiry. And it seems very deliberate. Dunbar Ortiz, what's interesting to me about her work, and it's interesting, and as well as many other people of color or women that have come through as scholars now in her writing, there's a lot that was missed that's very dark, very grim in U.S. history. And when you talk about poor whites. I don't even like that term because it has a history.
I don't either. I despise it. Yeah.
But if you look at, like, you and I both come from, what they used to call Scots-Irish stock, Appalachian Scots-Irish stock. Mine is mainly just Irish. But the thing is that when you look at those people, our ancestors, were used as shock troops, poor shock troops, by the landed gentry. And Ortiz makes that very clear with in our research. They were used specifically in this way. They would meet up at a boundary of claimed land claimed by England with England / the governorships that were granted, the charters that were granted. They would meet that boundary of native land and were told not to cross it. And then they would go and a few of them would go and attack native peoples, butcher them, rob their lands, their crops, and so forth, and then be given no sort of repercussion and very soon a deed to that land. However, that deed was taken from them by the landed gentry very soon after that. So what you had is this continual push of poor dupes. Poor white dupes. White was just then becoming a category. White onto native lands.
Right.
That's how all the plantations were formed from Muskogee Nation land and so forth. And it's hard to articulate that because you have such a weird racial mysticism in the U.S. Fueled by our media that if you look at the few times that people set aside the racial complexities that we've unfortunately inherited and taken on a class perspective, they become very dangerous, like the tenant farmers' revolts with black and white farmers.
That's right.
I'm sorry, I stole that from you. Go ahead.
No, that's absolutely. I mean, those are all points that I'm living by right now. You're sharp, Terry. I mean, you articulated it right on in ways I can't, but I feel. And it does help explain this Trump era and where it's coming from. Although I really can't understand it, but I do understand it.
Yeah,
it's complex.
What's your take from as someone who's traveled the world? Yeah. I mean, you've been to Yemen, you've been obviously Sweden.
I have.
What's your take looking from afar to this madness right now? I have my own. I can counter with or add to.
You mean the take how it came about, or the take of where it's going to go?
Well, this is not to be mystical about this. Be spending time with people who haven't had their heads dunked in the toilet of American media, and when you're around good people or people that don't have that kind of skull washing there, it helps to heal you. And so
it does. It does, but you know what? The American dream, American mysticism has, or let's say American hope. American hope has traveled to all the corners of this world. People really needed the hope, or whatever the myth of America, the package that was sold. They need to think that there's a place where you can be free and where everybody will have a chance. It's never existed for real. But that desire is there. So people, I've been in a lot of communities who've been at or currently are going to be in a state of war or genocide, and they need a lot of people refuse. And I'm speaking in broad strokes, broad generalities, but a lot of folks refuse to think that this could happen to America, but in their gut, from talking to folks, everyone sees it. The playbook is clear as day of oligarchy and dictatorship and brainwashing. And it can go far. And America is not immune to anything. We think we are. American exceptionalism is a dangerous pill of self-righteousness, and I'm afraid it's deluded us to the point of we have no self-evaluation ability.
No, I agree. We really need that at this point. That's why I bring people like you on, who are out of the prison, at least the psychological prison.
Right. So people want that hope. They hope it's amazing how many places that the U.S. has helped destroy and bomb very actively still have a hope and desire for America and still want to give it a chance of being that dream being real for them too.
That dream,
yeah. Go ahead.
When I think about that, I used to have a view of that the United States had some really, as a whole. I mean, it's a gigantic place, but had some good to it, and kept taking missteps, and also had very ugly elements. But anymore, I look at the founding fathers and the principles on which the country stands as equivalent to Mao's Red Book. It's very beautiful, but behind it is a monster. And
I share that. This is going to be a boring conversation because I share that absolutely.
I agree.
Several things you said.
Well, let's look at Trump though. Where do you think that idea? Because you're in Sweden now, and other countries have their own idea of their own exceptionalism. If you look at the mid-20th century,
they sure do.
The French and the Germans. I mean, they didn't really get along very well. Not but earlier culturally before they were shooting at each other. So, where do you think American exceptionalism and this idea that we're somehow special and that South Sudan won't happen here, given our politics?
Where do I think that stems from?
Our exceptionalism, our personal brainwashing on that topic.
Oh my God! Well, if I'm hearing you correctly, it's a deep can of worms for where American exceptionalism comes from. It's in our very wiring from the get-go, of course. I am so sick. I'm going to go back a little second.
Yeah.
I'm so sick of the hearing. Like I listen here to some of what's going on in Washington right now, and talking about the framers. The founding fathers and the framers, and if United States is the only place in the world that has this kind of worship for these white guy rich slave owners 200 and umpteen years ago. I mean, it's so inorganic at this point. Talk about worshiping some kind of deity, which we do that a lot anyway. Sweden. I keep expecting. I have a lot of political conversations here with Swedes and other folks, and from other countries, and everyone sees the corruption of Trump, and I have to be careful now because when I first got here, I thought everybody would be on the same boat about Trump.
Right.
And the right, I hate calling it the right, but I usually, in informal conversations, I just call them Nazis.
Which is basically accurate.
Which is, nationalist, racist nationalism. A lot of people really look up to Trump abroad, too, in the weirdest places. And in the Middle East, they love him. We lived in the United Arab Emirates for a couple years in Abu Dhabi, and that was, you'd think they wouldn't like that kind of American exceptionalism, but it's played well for them. I learned a lot about Eric Prince when I lived there, by the way, because he was based there with one of the later versions of Blackwater. He changed the name a few times, and that's. Here I go. I'm going to go off a different way about living abroad and being like a Forrest Gump. I don't like what American films like Forrest Gump, but it kind of sums up how I feel like my life has accidentally led me into all these different situations of meeting CIA or spies or being picked up, and because when you're in these places, whenever you put yourself outside the gates of the fort, things can happen. Interesting things, magic can happen. Not to get mystical, but you meet all the players for sure. And when you live in places like the UAE, it's like being in that Star Wars jazz bar, where all the people from the universe come and they drink and listen to the music and party, even though they're warring each other and they're 50 miles away. And that's really true.
I'm curious.
It's amazing.
About that. We're gonna. Well, I mean, we still have about almost 10 minutes left in the program, and I'm gonna have to have you.
Oh man, we ain't talked about anything.
I know.
Yet.
We just touched it, and I want to give a shout out before we get closer because I do want to thank Kent, the host who's before me, for helping with figuring out the call from Sweden. But yeah, I really want to get into that because if you I've been studying French for a couple of years, and I'm studying Spanish now, and especially studying French, I listen to a lot of French news and read a lot of French press. And getting that kind of perspective alone is, I don't want to say refreshing, but it really pushes me to see like how you can interpret things outside of the context of Americanism. I mean, even my context is I'm still an American citizen, and so even if I have a radical disagreement, it's within that spectrum. And even if I'm an international reader, I'm still within that spectrum. And I'm really curious about these things. I'll say as little as I can about this and make the point, but a fellow told me about having a contract mission riding in a helicopter in Indonesia in the 70s. Obviously, he's much older than me. And he wound up at a bar. He said, he wasn't exactly sure what they're doing. I don't know how true that is or not. I'm, in terms of my recounting, but he wound up in a bar and he was talking with Indonesian fighters that were out to counteract aggressively, let's say, what he was doing. And what they were doing ultimately was working for Texaco and other places to terrify the East Timorese for American corporations to get that oil. And you have to wade through, no pun intended, wade through a lot of slime to get to that core of truth as to what was happening. And it's intriguing to me, you're going into places where the raw ugliness of why American corporations are using the American military to intervene, and there's no hiding it. You can't hide a Filipino worker in the 80s going to Saudi Arabia and the enslavement of his wage labor at that time.
They're still enslaved. They're still enslaved.
Exactly.
I can't count them many times because a lot of my gigs internationally in Africa and the West Pacific, Micronesia, and the Middle East was doing airport runs. And I can't tell you how many times I've been in international airports in these places and watched people get off a plane and have their passports collected by a handler. And that's how the enslavement process begins. They're nannies. They're laborers. Right. They're from the Philippines, from Indonesia. There's sex trafficking going on all over the place, Russian and Eastern European. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's the wild, wild west.
Yeah.
Everywhere is the wild, wild west. And sometimes in amazing, beautiful ways, like living in Kenya and Ethiopia, crossing those lands is like there's not a fence anywhere. There are wild animals all over the place. There are shepherds and hunter-gatherers, and it is the Wild West. You realize, wow, America is a place, but it's not the be-all. Because we think, as Americans, we often think, why would I go there? I mean, This is from growing up in Kentucky. These are things I still hear. Well, why would you want to do that? Why would you go there? Why you want to leave America?
Yeah, and there's we're for all of our talk of being kind of gunslinger individualists in this country, we're very orderly, very obedient, very frightened people, and very broke. One of my models when I was a shipyard worker, I would paint people around me a lot, and I had one model who's been in a number of paintings and drawings. He was a welder at the shipyard, and he was older, and had grown up basically in a barn, tortured in sticks in Kentucky. He passed away, and at his funeral, his son was asked by someone who wanted to go to. No, I'm telling this wrong. He actually, before he passed away, he was at someone's house, trailer, whatever, and he asked about going to Florida. And the guy who was recounting this to me, who had actually left the shipyard and gone to Fallujah, of all places,
oh my God, yes.
He said none of us knew how to get to Florida. We knew that, one of the big highways that went straight south, you could connect to it a few miles away, and you should probably take that. But these are people like you're in a giant country with all this mythology of mobility and financial strength and military strength, and you don't even know how to get down, several states. It's tragic.
Yeah, well, we've let education fall off the planet.
Yeah.
In the U.S. But another story, going back a little bit, that just popped in my head is when we lived in Mombasa, Kenya, and I've lived in Kenya a few times, and we were in Mombasa. We were up in Lamu, which is up near the Somali border. It's a touristy area. It's a traditional Swahili town. They don't have any cars, islands. It's like classic imagery of Sinbad or something like that, because the Swahili sailors from East Africa were part of the Omani Empire for the whole Arab world.
Right.
So it's a really interesting place, but it's hard to get to. And we were there for a month or two doing some programs. I was in this cafe by a friend who owns a cafe, Swahili. He goes by the title Bush Baby, and he calls it Bush Gardens. And I think he's been to Florida once. So Bush Gardens. Anyway, I was sitting there, and a boat pulls up, and it's full of Americans in safari leisure wear. They get out and they come in the cafe and sit down all around me. But they don't know who I am. I could be, Russian. I could be French. I could be whoever, a white Kenyan. But they have this big meeting all around me as I'm sitting there being quiet and just kind of observing. And a friend of mine is actually their tour guide. This was the 2003 or 4, I think. This is the Air Sea College. All these American generals were there evaluating the East African coast for bases of operation and drone bases, and they were talking about this shit they were on. I'm sorry, they were on a. It's like they were on a vacation or a frat party vacation. They were in their civilian wear, and I couldn't believe how leisurely they were with what they were talking about in these places, because they assume no one around them knows anything or even speaks their language.
Right.
And so there's a lot of stories of being in places and just kind of being a fly on the wall and, seeing things like that. And it was really interesting. It turns out what they were talking about happened. And the militarization, the U.S. militarization of bases in Djibouti, all around Somalia, in the Kenyan borderlands. It's really amazing how many things are done in America's name in places where Americans don't know exist.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's unbelievable. And you keep seeing examples of it everywhere. You can see, of course, in Europe. I can see World War II examples here, or examples right now from the intel operations that are happening with Russia.
Right.
There's all kinds of Russia scare happening on the Baltic right now.
And I'm sure that's pushing the Nazi contingent in Sweden as well as the immigration. That's its own story.
Oh, yeah.
Well, Ephraim,